First and foremost, I want to thank you so much for taking out the time to stop by and come on the platform and talk about some of the amazing work that you've been doing over the years.
Blessings, blessings. Yes, Brother Tay, I'm honored to be here and honored to have a conversation.
Likewise, this is a tremendous honor. For the viewers who may not recognize you, let them know who you are, where you're from, and definitely what do you do.
Okay, so my name is Donald Jones. I am professor of law at the University of Miami School of Law. And I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. I grew up in East Baltimore, which was the inner city. And to try to give you a flavor of it, The Wire, which was a popular show that ran as late as 2008, one of the most popular shows in the last 20 years, was shot a few blocks from where I grew up. So I grew up in the inner city, what many people call the hood. But I went to NYU. Somehow I got out. I went to NYU, one of the top law schools in the country, and a miracle happened, and I was able to go from the background I grew up in to become a law professor. It's no small step.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Man, big shout out to Baltimore, definitely.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah, yeah, and shout out
Great
to the
city,
Wire
great
as well.
city, great people. And Baltimore is a city that has a lot of history. It's a deep history of segregation. It has a history also, though, of people working hard and trying to build. Kurt Smoke was the mayor of Baltimore. We went to high school together. Elijah Cummings was a congressman in Baltimore. He was a good friend. So I think of Baltimore warmly. It's still my spiritual home.
Yeah, yeah, yes, indeed. I don't know if I told you this or not. I'm currently in Africa. I'm in East Africa. I'm in Madagascar, so it's not
Wow.
as technologically advanced here. So if I
Yes.
get disconnected, it will continue to record, and you can keep speaking, and then
Okay.
I'll go back and edit it before I put the episode out.
Understood. Understood. So if you mind if I call you Tay, is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, that's perfectly fine. And I was gonna add, I do like I've been to like 20 African countries, so I do like
Yes.
group tours to Africa. I've had
Beautiful.
the pleasure of taking two groups from Baltimore. I took a group in 2022 to South Africa. They was all from
Okay.
Baltimore. And
Okay.
then this year I took a group to Ghana, a whole nother group from Baltimore. So they
Yes.
really
Yes. Yes.
phenomenal people.
Well, I encourage that. Clearly, there's a Pan African spirit that you have, and Sheikh Anta Diop and many others are people that I've read, and so from reading them, have some of that spirit as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Now, I was gonna ask you, in terms of law, like when did you develop this passion? Is this something that you was kind of always into when you were younger?
Well,
Does
you
it
see,
run in your family?
when I grew up, there was a sense that there was a ceiling on how far Black people could go. And it wasn't until I would say the late 60s that America began its experiment with what we would later call affirmative action. And so, in theory, I benefited from that. But to be honest, I had a mother who believed deeply in me, and she instilled me with a sense of pride, a sense of purpose, and a sense of confidence, and the idea that I could go places. But she said, "Well, you've got to have to study." And so, whatever I could study, I read the dictionary from cover to cover. I read encyclopedia from cover to cover. I worked hard when I was in school, and I went to inner city schools. When I was in the ninth grade, I remember the average reading level at my junior high was second grade, but I was reading at college level, and I continued that effort. So, for example, when I was in from the time I was in junior high to the time I was in high school, every day I went to the library if the library was open. It didn't matter whether it's cold, raining, snow. I was always at the library every day. I never missed a day. When I went to high school, I never missed a day of school. Whether I was sick or well, I never missed a day. Never missed a day. And when I about to graduate from high school, colleges were sending their brochures to me as if I was a professional, like a special athlete. So I literally could have walked into Harvard had I applied, but I had a counselor who discouraged me. He said, "Well, blacks don't usually get into Harvard," and so I was discouraged. But nonetheless, I think I got a great education, and I went on to become a civil rights lawyer. And it was only after practicing civil rights law for about 10 years that I had the courage to try to apply to be a law professor, and the rest is history. The rest is history.
Wow, that's really inspiring. I mean, you said so much. Definitely a lot of people I feel like take the library for granted. That's one of the most amazing places, you
Yes.
know. So I love the library. I've grown to love it. You know, when I was younger, I didn't think it was so much fun, but that's definitely where it's at.
It opens
Um,
doors. It opens doors. My imagination needed a door, and that gave me a way uh, to walk down the corridors of history. It gave me a way to go to other countries, in a sense, to at least understand something of the tapestry of the human drama of which I was a part. And we're all part of that drama. I think our goal as Black people, this is what Mandela says. He says, our goal is to be a human being. First, we have to have a strong grasp of our identity. That's first. And that's going to be a struggle. That's a battle. But if we can get that, we want to ultimately try to find a way to realize our full potential as human beings. And that's my think. I think that the problem of race separates us. You see, we have to find a way to break down barriers that are based on race and be able to relate to all people. First, to African people, we need to take out this idea of Afrocentricity. I agree with that, but I think ultimately our ultimate goal, speaking in the spirit of Mandela, is that we have to try to realize our full potential as human beings. That sounds
yeah,
contradictory, but I think those two ideas go together.
yeah, no, they go together very well. I wanted to ask you something else. You had mentioned like affirmative action and employment and
Yes,
education. You know, with the politics and things changing in 2024, for
yes,
someone say if and I could ask you this if you could speak to it. If you in the workplace, you've been there 10 years, 20 years, whatever, you know, you apply for the next position, you apply for the
yes,
promotion, and you see people come in that are of a different color that may not have the time, may not have the experience, and they get the promotion or they get the job over you, you know, what what does a person that is black or minority have to combat that or fight against that, you know,
well,
outside of going to the
I think
HR?
it's clear. I think it's clear. We have to be better. But I mean, it's so. I just remind. I'm just thinking of. I have in my mind an image of a black kid in Harlem, a black kid in South Central LA, and they're still on the basketball court. It's 11 o'clock at night, but they're still on the basketball court. You see, we have to be that kid. We have to be the kid that goes to the library every day, that doesn't miss a day from school. We have to be the kid that stays after class to ask the teacher questions. We have to be the kid that says, yes, I could, hang out over here, but also I could practice the cello. Maybe I could figure out a way to advance myself by understanding mathematics a little bit better. We have to be ambitious. We have to put in extra work, put in extra time, and we have to have the confidence to believe that there's nothing that we can't achieve. Now, if you can put confidence together with hard work, ask LeBron how he became LeBron. Ask Stephen Curry how he became Curry. He'll tell you that he had to put in work, but he also had to have confidence. And he also had to have a vision. All those things have to flow together. You have to have a vision. You have to have confidence, and you have to be willing to put in work. And so it's a struggle for all of us. But I think it starts with having that dream. You've got to have a dream, and then it proceeds when you're willing to put in the work and the time to nourish that dream every day. Every
Yeah,
day.
definitely. Definitely, a lot of people take it for granted the work that, like you say, a LeBron has put in. Because we just see him when he's on the floor. We don't see
Right.
how many hours he practiced or what he ate or what he didn't eat that he really wanted. He probably wanted to eat ice cream, but he wanted to win so bad he had to have that discipline and go without, to eat like a champion, before he
The
could go
victory
on.
has to come first within. You have to overcome your fears, your doubts, your insecurities, and create that vision. Then everything else is simply the manifestation of of what you've already built inside of yourself. It has to come from inside, and then you can manifest. But it has to begin with confidence and with a dream.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Now I wanted to ask you about some of your books.
Yes,
Presumption. If you
sir.
could talk about what inspired you to write that, what is
Well,
it about? And
well, see, I feel injustice. Injustice isn't just something I write about; it's something that I feel. Most people who become law professors pursue a career, and their goal is to advance as far as they can in their career. And that's a concern, and that's legitimate. But my concern has been, how do I use the platform that I have to understand the predicament of Black people, particularly Black people who are still trapped in what we tend to call inner city ghettos. How do we help the poor? How do we help the Black poor? How do we use our skills to speak into the world something emancipatory for them? You see, and so my goal has been, for the last several decades, to try to understand these problems. My role model is W.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois focused on two questions. One question was, what is race? The other is, what is discrimination? And that occupied most of his life. And I think most of us, most Black scholars agree that Du Bois is the greatest Black thinker of the 20th century. And so I try to follow in the footsteps, to stand on the shoulders of Du Bois. And my work is about those same two questions: what is race? What is discrimination? And I would argue that one of the problems we still have in our society is that we don't understand race very well. We don't know how to talk about race. And it's particularly true in law. And courts have a concept of discrimination which terminates before it reaches the lived experience of Black people. Just imagine a bridge that goes out into the water and stops before it reaches the other shore. That's the problem we have in law, that the law has an image of of discrimination which doesn't make contact with what Blacks are experiencing. There's a disconnect. And so my goal is to try to make a connection, to bridge between where the law is and where it needs to be, in order for people to comprehend the Black experience, to try to find that bridge, to bridge that gulf.
yeah,
Now,
yeah, definitely.
and let me just say a little bit more. You see, in the last 10, 20 years, America's had an incredible experience. Now, today, in theory, we're woke, and part of the woke idea is that America has rejected racism. So, in theory, that's true. But if we just go back a few years, go back to 2006, 2007, 2000, up to 2014 and 15, America was engaged in a number of what they call wars. There was a war on drugs. They called it a war on drugs, but the war on drugs tended to be a war fought in the Black community. There is no such thing as a war against drugs. Drugs are an inanimate object. Wars are always fought against a particular community in a particular place. The war on drugs, and I don't know whether it was intentional or not. I don't make that allegation, but the war on drugs was fought in the Black community. And the Black community became the subject of military style campaigns which targeted them disproportionately. And so I've been focused on that for many years. I've also focused on the war on crime. War on crime is this idea that, well, we're not going to let small crimes get by. If a person jaywalks, if a person walks down the street with an open container, we're going to arrest them. We're going to go into schools. We're not going to let kids get away with, and we're going to arrest kids. And so we began a war on crime. We began a war on drugs, so-called wars on drugs. They're wars against, I think, a particular community. And blacks disproportionately were arrested, and that produced what is now called mass incarceration. It would, a better term would be predominantly the mass incarceration of people of color. And so, why is this true? Why I wanted to know, why is it that blacks are being massive disproportion? Why are black? To give you an idea, blacks and whites abuse drugs at statistically identical rates, particularly in the context of cocaine and marijuana. So the rates in which blacks allegedly abuse drugs is statistically identical to the rate at which whites abuse drugs. Start there. Now, let's look at what happens. Blacks nonetheless represent, Maryland did a study, 55% of those arrested. They represent 80% of those convicted. They represent 95% of those incarcerated in prison. How is that? How does that make sense? You look at the war on crime, you'll see similar statistics. Even with marijuana, in Florida, marijuana has been, quote, decriminalized, which means that police do not have to arrest. It's discretionary where they arrest someone. That's decriminalization. Blacks are an overwhelming disproportion, the people who get arrested for marijuana. Why is that? Now, you also go to cities like Baltimore. Baltimore had a black mayor. Kurt Smoke was the prosecutor, no, he was the mayor, and he's black. I know him personally. Stu Sims, his deputy, I know him personally. Now, what's interesting, Baltimore had a similar pattern. Overwhelmingly, the people being arrested were black people. So much so that a few years ago, the NAACP and the ACLU teamed up. They filed a lawsuit against the city of Baltimore, mayor and city of Baltimore, and they alleged that blacks were systemically being arrested in the inner city for these so-called quality of life crimes in disproportion to their race. And they were systemically being discriminated against. And the city did not fight the case. The city settled the case, and in essence conceded that they would be found liable for that. They decided we won't contest it. We'll just pay money. Systemically, they were arresting people for things like sitting on the steps, for walking down the street. Evan Howard is an example. Look up Evan Howard. There's a law review article in which it's called "Walking While Poor in the Black Community." Something that's about the title. And so the point is, I wanted to understand why these disparities existed. You find the disparities in Baltimore, you find those disparities in Boston, you find those disparities in Chicago, and look at New York stop and frisk. And when New York did a stop and frisk, they focused on the black community. Blacks were arrested at least twice as much as whites for so-called possession of guns. Now, but understand this, the guns were in overwhelming disproportion being possessed illegally in white communities. White communities were more likely to be places where illegal gun possession was taking place. Nonetheless, and statistics show that, nonetheless, the police commission focused on black people and black youth. Why? To bring this home, I no longer drive in Miami. I don't drive in Miami at night. And the reason I don't drive is because I don't want to get stopped. There's one woman I knew, and she lived in a black community in Miami. Miami has 27 different communities. And she lives in a black community, predominantly black neighborhood. And she said that she tries to calculate how much time she'll need based on the number of stops she thinks that will take place between her and the police. So she believes she has to build into her day time in which she's going. That's how often. There was one black man in Miami who was arrested, I think, 23 times illegally. It was so bad his employer set up a camera outside so that the police, and his employer was I think an Arab American. So why is this true? Why did we see the stop and frisk debacle that took place in New York. There was so many of these disparities, which are pervasive in the criminal justice system, hit me, and it hit me personally, that I want to try to understand why. Now, the narrative that I believe that we use, or that the media uses, that most people use to try to understand why this systemic racism exists, is racism in the form of hate. There's a notion that this is all white supremacy. And let's be clear, white supremacy is very real. We live in a country that has a history of systemic racism driven, at least historically, by white supremacy. There's no question white supremacy is real. But notice that the patterns that I'm talking about take place even in cities which are controlled nominally by Black mayors and Black city councils. Baltimore, go to Washington, D.C., they used to call it Chocolate City. In DC, you'll have a huge disproportion in terms of the number of Blacks going to prison and whites going to prison, probably the largest in the country, in Washington, D.C. So why? Why is it that even in cities where Blacks are, you see these same patterns? If you had to look at a show called The Wire, and I'm teaching a course called The Wire in the upcoming semester, you'll see Black police officers arresting Black people. Bunk, all of the people who are familiar characters. Bunk is Black. He's a Black detective. He's arresting Black people. They're all arresting Black people. They're targeting Black people. And they're comfortable with it because they see them as criminals, and they are. But you see that at the same time, even though the same amount of drugs are being abused in white communities, you don't see the police in The Wire going after the white communities. Why? Why is that? Now, I have a friend, his name's Kenneth Nunn. He says, well, race defines crime, and crime defines race. And so part of the Black experience, if you want to explain the Black experience, you would have to explain it, at least in part, in terms of the racism the criminal justice system is so pervasive that has become part of the fabric of the Black experience today. And all race defines crime. Right? Race not only defines race also defines crime. Well, let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's say that a person in the suburbs, a white person, white woman, white man, abuses opioids. Let's assume that. You've heard of the opioid controversy. Now, what happens to a person who abuses opioids when the criminal justice system finds them? I would say that what tends to happen is that the person who abuses opioids will go to a treatment facility. Now, a person who abuses cocaine, a Black person, second or third offense, you'll find them go to prison. So the system doesn't tend to see many of the crimes that white people commit as crimes. But similar actions by Blacks are seen as crime. If you look at who's being arrested for jaywalking, the people getting arrested for jaywalking in Florida all the time, you'll see a vast disproportion. There are people in the Black community who get arrested for carrying a bottle down the street if it's not in a paper bag. It's called a container violation. You will find very few container violations in any white community. In Fort Lauderdale, there was a Black woman who was arrested for riding her bicycle without a registration. Riding a bicycle without a registration. Now, I would challenge you to find a white person, a white woman, white male who's been arrested for. So why is that? And so this was what sparked my effort. And I don't believe it can be explained entirely by hate. I think it's something more pervasive, something deeper that explains it. And so I teach constitutional law, and we do a case called Dred Scott. And what happens in Dred Scott is the issue is whether or not a Black can be a citizen. And the court says, no, it's Justice Taney. A Black person, whether slave or free, cannot be a citizen. And the question is why? He says, well, there's an axiom that is at the foundation of the slave society, which is that Black people are inferior order of human life. This is an axiom that the court recognizes as being at the foundation of of the law of slavery. Blacks are an inferior order of human life. And so this axiom can be thought of also, a synonym for it is presumption. There's a presumption that blacks are inferior order of human life. That same presumption, which was explicit in slavery, goes forward in the era of Jim Crow. And so when you look at how ghettos were created, a strong reason is that the government, the federal government, did something called redlining. Redlining was an explicit policy under the federal government in which they wouldn't let blacks and whites live together. And the premise was that blacks were they had loose morals, that they weren't entirely civilized, that they were prone to crime. And so there was almost an explicit presumption. Was it done hatefully? And so what's interesting, the people who did it claimed that they were doing benevolently. They believed that segregation was helpful to blacks because if they lived around whites, whites would abuse them violently. So can you explain that by hate? I think only partially. And so I think that this there's a linkage between blacks and crime, blacks and immorality, blacks and deviance, and this presumption was explicit in Jim Crow. Now, what also happens is that around 1963, 64, 65, there is social unrest because we've embarked in this civil rights era, and blacks are now having access to houses and in white neighborhoods. Whites saw this as disorder. They become afraid. At the same time, in the mid to late 60s, there are riots because even though formal equality took place and equal opportunity laws were passed, there weren't any change in the conditions that blacks saw. And so they expressed it with their feet. And now when this happens, whites see this as disorder. They see it as criminal. And so between, I would say, 1960 and 1980 is a transformation, and the predominant narrative ceased to be that blacks were inferior, although that was still there, but the predominant narrative became that blacks were criminal. When Nixon ran for office, he argued that blacks represent a civilizational threat to America, that it was blacks who were primarily responsible for crime, blacks who were primarily responsible for drugs. He began the drug war. Reagan continued it. And so there was this idea that race and crime were linked together. So the bottom line is that there was an era of segregation. That era of segregation was founded, at least in part, on the premise that blacks were inferior. This premise that blacks were inferior, not merely inferior, but that there was a linkage within either whether it was biological or cultural. There was a linkage between blacks and crime, blacks and morality, blacks and deviance. And over time, that presumption evolved. During the civil rights era, when there were urban rebellions, when politicians, like President Nixon, ran for office, they began increasingly to associate blacks with crime, and particularly with drugs and violence. And so I would say since the late 60s to now, the predominant narrative is that that race and crime, that blackness and crime are linked. That is, I think, the argument that Reagan made when he launched the drug war. He decided that when he launched the drug war, he would predominantly target drug dealers in inner city neighborhoods. That was the explicit premise that Ronald Reagan used. And this was driven in part by a narrative that Len Bias, who had sold drugs to a promising basketball player, was typical of the problem. It was not. Another piece to this is that before the war against crack cocaine, the media went to black neighborhoods and filmed black neighborhoods as being roiled by and being pervasively infested by crack addicts. Now, you could have done the same thing with a lot of other neighborhoods, but the media predominantly focused its attention on drugs and violence on black people. There was a guy named Robert Altman who did a study and showed that this was disproportionate, but it never stopped. So people talk about social construction. So part of the problem is that Black communities have been socially constructed to be uh, communities of criminals. And you see this on television when the black community is portrayed. It's portrayed as being a hotbed of crime, a no man's land. You see, and so what my idea is that the problem is not merely a question of hate, but the problem is a question of how we see. It's a cognitive problem. Race has been so associated with crime that it's almost that as if blacks become invisible. They don't see the individual; they see the stereotype. They see an expression of the narrative. Ellison wrote about this in Invisible Man. Franz Fanon wrote a very similar narrative about the problem. In Ellison's book, he says that race has become a kind of opaque glass, and so it's that idea that I'm exploring in my book. How this narrative that blacks are criminals functions as the opaque glass that Ellison talks about. That it just that when I come into a room, if I don't have a law degree written on my lapel, whether it's the a supermarket, when I come into a subway, when I'm walking down an apple, people don't see a law professor; they see a black man, and that race and that blackness is associated, is not together this narrative. And so the presumption is about this narrative that black people seem to carry with us. It's about how identities have been criminalized. And what I try to do is to tell stories that show clearly how this criminalization is a reality in black life. I look at the case of Ossian Sweet. Ossian Sweet was a black man who had gone to school in Europe. He became a dentist. He wanted to buy property in Cleveland, I believe it was, and it was a white neighborhood. And as soon as he moved in, a white mob surrounded his house to try to drive him out. Someone fired a shot. It wasn't him; he didn't have a gun, but he was prosecuted for the homicide of a white man, even though he didn't have a gun, even though it was his house that was being attacked by a white mob. He was tried for murder, and every member of his family, including his wife, was tried for murder. He was represented by Clarence Darrow, and Clarence Darrow said that, wait a minute, he says, these men have, he told the jury, these men were already guilty because society sees these black people as criminals. This is Clarence Darrow in the 1930s. And he was able to humanize these, Ossian Sweet, and got a hung jury. But absent heroic representation, he would have been sentenced to death. And so for defending his home. So this is this. How else but a presumption can we explain that? When we go forward, we find not only is there presumption that black communities are hotbeds of crime. The Supreme Court has a concept called high crime areas. And so what the Supreme Court has said is that in a so-called high crime area, then the police need less specific facts, and we can simply, in a sense, presume that criminal activity is afoot. And now the high crime area technically is a high crime area, but they tend to be, if you look at each particular area that's labeled high crime area, you'll see that there are few or none of those areas which are white. High crime areas are almost always black. Why is that? And so the book is trying to focus on how within the criminal justice system, race and criminality have been fused together, not overtly today, but implicitly. Not overtly in the media, but implicitly. And so there is this implicit, and now people often say, well, this is implicit bias. Well, in a sense it is. But what I want to argue is this is something that is deeply embedded now in our culture. It's deeply embedded now in policies like those that target black communities. It's deeply embedded in a dichotomy between how blacks are arrested for cocaine and in prison, but whites are not in prison for that. How blacks are arrested in prison for marijuana, but whites are not. And this goes to it goes into the boardroom. It goes into the schools. The presumption follows children to school. Why is it that if you ask who is being arrested in schools, we're arresting children in school. We're suspending children in school, we're expelling children. Who are the children that are being suspended? These are black kids predominantly. Uh, and so, in every area germane to life in which our criminal justice systems touches, in every area you see this disproportion, and I think that it cannot. It's so systematic that I don't think it can be explained entirely by hate. I think that in part this is a question of cognitive bias, which is caused by the fact that blackness as a social identity has been criminalized. Blackness as a social identity has been knotted together with crime. When you walk down the street, it's as if you're carrying with you, tied to us, an evil twin. And people don't see you, they see the twin. The twin is nothing but a narrative, but that's what they see. So I still remember when I first started practicing law, I went to a prison. I worked in the prison project, and I had a paralegal with me. And the paralegal was not well dressed. I was. I had the briefcase. He didn't. And when the guard came to see whether we get in, he talked to my paralegal as if the paralegal was the lawyer.
Mm.
And he had to tell him, no, he's the lawyer. I'm just the paralegal. Uh, I mean, I still remember once I went to Atlanta, and I was standing outside a hotel. I was dressed very well. And what was interesting, there was a basketball player got out. He handed me his keys to his car, like I was obviously there to park his car. I couldn't have been. When I first moved into my house, I live in a house that, maybe it's worth a couple of dollars. It's a nice house. And when I moved in, one of the neighbors saw me. He saw me walking my dog. And at the time, I think I had some pants on which were loose. And so maybe he thought these were saggy pants. Whatever it is, noticed that after I brought the dog into the house, the police knocked on my door and asked me to prove that I had a right to be in the house. I had to prove that I had a right to be in my own house. I paid a lot of money. I won't tell you just, but I paid a lot of money living out. But I had to prove I had a right to be here because obviously my neighbor called the police. Why is that? And so, the problem of race did not end with George Floyd. America can say that it's woke, but in my life, I haven't seen any transformation. I still don't drive in Miami. And so the presumption is my testimony. The presumption is my effort to say that the gulf between the law and justice is still as deep today as it was in 1930 or 1950. One way to think of it is this. I'm writing about the fact that blacks are plagued not just by hatred, but by a pervasive set of assumptions and narratives in which we have been thought of as the enemy or as a criminal. You see something similar in the 1940s when the Japanese were viewed as the enemy, and they hauled them off into relocation centers, which were really concentration camps. And when they did it, they didn't just do it out of hatred, which I'm sure was there, but they justified it by saying, "Well, this is reasonable racism on our part because it's reasonable discrimination because we have a national security issue." But reasonable discrimination was the claim. And I think what we're confronting today, what blacks increasingly are confronting, is a notion of racism which is more bold than it's ever been in the past. It's a notion of racism that says, well, it's sometimes reasonable for us. Think of the blacks who were in Starbucks and the woman calls the police on them. There are white people sitting around, taking Wi-Fi and not buying anything, and nothing happens to them. But blacks do the same thing. They're arrested. Why? Why? And I think that the concept was, well, it was reasonable for us to do that. There was a black woman who was in the dorm at Yale, and she's sleeping in a dorm where she pays tuition. And she was arrested for sleeping in a dorm where she pays tuition. And so she was arrested, and I'm sure there are white students who do the same thing. Why? You see, I think that there's an assumption that still haunts us that race and crime have been knotted together, and that's what I'm writing about. Forgive me for talking. I mean, I'm so passionate about what I write about that I could go on forever. I should have let you, but let me stop. I just want to stop to answer any questions you may have, or to make, or hear any comments that you want to make.
Ah, man. I mean, you said so much. I'm still processing everything that you said, but I mean, it's exactly what a lot of people go through, what a lot of people feel and think, because sometimes you know something isn't right, but you just don't have the knowledge to understand, what's happening to you. Like you say, you automatically associate it with something that you might not know nothing about, and then we try
Yes,
to either normalize it, or like you say, you got to stop driving, or you don't take this route to work, or you just modify your life so much, and then ultimately you still end up having to deal with it. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I travel so much. Really, my goal
yes,
is to live in Africa. You know what I'm saying? It may not be the best solution for everybody. It's not perfect, but I just got I just got disgusted with kind of living like that. You go in the store and people follow you around, and you get to the point where you feel like, okay, let me ask for
you
help, or let me
experienced the
say,
presumption. You
yeah,
said
because
people follow you around. I'm sorry.
right, but I'm saying you get what I'm saying is, the stereotype, like, okay, you go into the store, they follow you
Yes,
around because you black, but you get to the point where you say, before you even go in the store, like, I know they follow me around, so let me ask for help so they don't think I'm stealing. You putting yourself in that mind frame, and they might not even be paying you attention. You get what I'm saying? You get
yeah, no,
so
no, no. Yeah, I
comfortable.
feel you. I feel you very, very entirely. But you see, the point is that it has been normalized, and it's normalized so much people have ceased to be almost aware of it. But I want people to be aware. I want people to be uncomfortable. And if we're uncomfortable, we want to make the authorities uncomfortable. But the bottom line is that we are still, to me, in a sense, experiencing a kind of segregation. Yes, we can live in all these neighborhoods. Yes, we can go in all these stores. But are we treated the same in those neighborhoods? Are we treated the same when we go into those stores? You see. And so there are different kinds of borders. There's a border that says, well, you can't come in the country. And then there are borders that are in the minds of people that say, well, we still will not accept you as one of us. You see, that's the border that's have we ever crossed that line? Yes, we can cross the line between the suburbs and the city, but have we crossed the line between us and them? And that's what race does. It draws a line between us and them, and it still does. And I'm trying to get at how it does that. How is it that we are still experiencing this kind of being fenced out? Why is it? How is it? And I want to argue it has a lot to do with how we are seen, not just the question of hate, but how we are seen, and how the narratives that began in slavery continue to cloud the lenses people use.
Indeed, indeed. It sounds phenomenal. I'm gonna have to check out the book. I'm sure the viewers is gonna check it out as well. Thank you so much. This really been a great interview, and I appreciate the work that you have put into doing that research, because, like you say, it's definitely necessary, and ultimately, I think it will enlighten and even empower people to, keep on. The struggle continues to make
Yes,
change.
Aluta Continua. If you've heard of Millicard Cabral, he had this statement. He said, "Aluta Continua, the struggle continues." If I may, the book is called The Presumption. It's available on Amazon. It may cost a couple of dollars, but I believe that anyone who reads it will find it hard to put down, and I think it will open your eyes to some of the realities and help you understand what we're going through.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And rest in peace to Emil Carcabra. I've been to Cape Verde. It's a beautiful place. They fought
Yes,
and did what
yes.
they had to do. But I really appreciate you coming on the platform. So
Well, I
until next
appreciate
time.
you. I appreciate you. It's an honor to know you. And I see you not just as a videographer, but as a brother. And I
Oh,
hope you feel the
likewise,
same.
King. That really mean a lot to me.